Hello everybody, and I'm really pleased that you're here today to listen to Graham. I've met hundreds of people who were sexually abused as children since I first started writing about this particular subject in 2006. I can honestly say that Graham is one of the standout people that I have had the privilege to meet while doing this work. We first saw each other in 2012. It was only a few weeks before the Royal Commission was announced. It was a meeting down in Sydney, and Graham was sitting up the back of the meeting, and I saw him from the stage, and I thought, I knew just from looking at him that there was something extraordinary about him. He left before I had a chance to meet him, and thank heavens he contacted me shortly after that. I first interviewed him, and it was only, I think, about 2 weeks before the Royal Commission was announced, and at that stage we didn't know it was going to be announced. An article went in the paper, and then the Royal Commission was announced, so I sort of feel, even on that score, Graham's really special to me. When you hear what Graham has done, special doesn't even come close, extraordinary doesn't come close. So I am very, very proud to be speaking to him today. Graham was in a home that was run by the Salvation Army in South Australia. Graham, I've described him as the Salvation Army's worst nightmare, because Graham decided that on behalf of both himself and many, many, many other children, that he was going to get the Salvation Army to tell the truth about how it treated children. He was also going to hold them accountable, and he certainly did. So I'm going to ask Graham first up. And we're freezing up here, I just want everyone to know that. And I've got more layers on than Graham has.
We are too.
Yeah. All right, well, everyone jiggle a bit. So Graham, can you tell me about when you were a child and how you first came to be at Eden Park Children's Home run by the Salvation Army?
Well, my mother left when I was about 18 months old. My nana came to look after me till I was about 5, and by that time my father had married again. For about 6 or 8 months I lived with my stepmother. Eventually we didn't get on, and my father said that he was going to take me to a place where there was lots of kids to play with, and it'd be just for 2 or 3 weeks.
A holiday, wasn't it?
A holiday, yeah. And he took me to Eden Park.
And what year was this?
1960.
1960.
And I stayed there till 1968. So it was a long holiday.
It was a very long holiday.
Yes.
Can you? And it wasn't a holiday.
No, it certainly wasn't a holiday.
Can you tell me what happened when you were dropped? When you arrived at the home?
When I first arrived, I got introduced to Ellis, Sergeant Ellis.
Sergeant Ellis is somebody who's going to feature further.
Yeah, heavily. Then your clothes are taken, your little bag is taken.
Do you mind telling us what happened in terms of with your father?
Well, first he told me to stay in the truck. We went in his work truck. He went over and said he came out with Ellis. They spoke for a few minutes. He called me over, told me who Ellis was. He just turned, patted me on the head and just drove off. That was it.
So it's important to know that, because we have to think back, this is 1960, and one of the things that's coming out of the Royal Commission is, the Royal Commission really is a hearing about the rights of children. And what you see over and over and over again at the Royal Commission is the powerlessness of children, and stories just like that, where Graham's father dropped him off at the age of 7, basically tapped him on the head, told him he was going for a holiday and then left. It just repeated over and over and over again, and it's shocking to even think of that today. But and I say that just because it gives an idea how extraordinary Graham is, that's in your background, that even that single act and so much more. So Graham is 7 years of age at the home, and there's a Salvation Army Sergeant Ellis who's his first point of contact. And so what was life like at that home?
Well, it was very disciplined. Everything was by a bell, so there was a bell. You lined up to the bell, you went to school to the bell, to the meals by bell. Everything was very strict routine, but everything was fear. Like the strap, most kids got the strap within the first 2 or 3 days of being there. There was a lock-up, of course.
We'll get back to the lock-up.
It was just a lot of physical abuse from the officers to every kid, because the idea was to break your spirit. Once you have the fear, then they tend to control you more. So that was the theory.
At the home, about a third of the children were Indigenous. There were some children who were described as out of control. Some children were described as delinquents. Some children were just given up by their parents. And the Salvation Army had responsibility for them. And some documents that Graham and I have just been reading shows that even though in theory there was government oversight, in practice there was not.
No,
there certainly was not. Can you tell me the first time that you were confronted with, say, physical abuse, as in the strap, and what was the context of that and who by?
Well, the first real would have been only a couple of months, and someone had stolen something from the kitchen. It's like kitchen boy, and so they didn't own up, and so in that circumstances we all got the strap.
Yeah.
And that's how it worked. Or there was another punishment where you had to stand quiet and you had to have your arms straight out in the air or up in the air, just depends. But what Ellis used to sneak out, or not sneak out, but walk out and say you had to do something. Because the window was so tall and he was so short, it was always a ladder next to the window. And what they would do is want you to muck up.
Yeah.
It's like lining up for meals. The brigadier used to hide, and the duty officer would then disappear, and he'd be behind us all the time and just waiting for someone to muck up, and then in with the punishment. The Aboriginals boys copped it a lot worse usually when they first arrived, because they were from missions, or a couple of them had never wore shoes or eaten with knife and fork. They copped it heaps. First,
there was an active policy of breaking their spirit.
Well, the first thing was to hold them down, cut their hair, just cut all that, because they had massive hair, and then straight into the lock-up.
Yeah.
Because the lock-up was designed to break the spirit.
And the lock-up, can you describe the lock-up?
Well, the lock-up's 6x4. Well, it's not quite 6x4. There's no windows. It's still the same. It's stone walls that have been limed. It's stone floor. There was a horsehair mattress, and that's it.
And the fact that there was a lock-up was known by certainly people in the South Australian government, and Graham has documents that prove that. So it wasn't something that wasn't known. Children were kept in that lock-up, which had a bolt outside.
Yeah, it was built in 1910, and it was added to the original building, and it was on the plan it says storeroom.
Yeah.
So originally it was built to put vegetables in, I presume, hence the dark. But it never was used for that. It was always used for a lock-up.
So it was a dark, very small, tiny room.
Yeah, it was 6. It's actually 5'6" by 3'6".
How does that compare? You're a builder. What does that constitute in terms of, so that people can understand size-wise?
Well, it's really 6x4.
A toilet?
Yeah. Well, it's a pretty small toilet.
Yeah.
Because the mattress was an old-fashioned horsehair, which is a bit narrower, short and a bit shorter. But for things to do, I used to try and turn the mattress around. You couldn't actually turn the mattress back to the door because it was only 3'6", so it had to lay the 6 foot length.
Now, you were sexually assaulted at Eden Park many times.
Well, within 2 or 3 days of arriving, obviously it must have been a weekend, and we had Saturday night. We sat in the library, and it started there. Was a boy put his hand on mine and grabbed his hand, and then eventually I was in a little boys' dormitory, which was all the little boys, because it's where kids that wet the bed, and then he came in and forced me then, and within a week, to masturbate him in the toilet and do other, and that's how it basically started. And then it was 2 or 3 times a week from the boys until about 3 months in, and I was really badly raped, and that's when I first went to Ellis.
Yeah.
And I was just told to stand there. Eventually he came back, took me up to the top of the shower room, made me shower. I was abused for causing a problem. Nothing was done. That's the one I really first remember, because as a 7-year-old, I had no idea what had just happened, and I was bleeding badly, and all I could remember, and I still remember today, it was like red cordial on the floor. It happened again 6 months later, the same thing. I went to Ellis because he was duty officer. He said he would look after me if it ever happened again. It happened really badly from the first person that did it again. And from then on, basically Ellis started abusing me. And by 10, Ellis was raping me as well.
So Graham was badly sexually assaulted by other boys at the home, and then when he turned to the adult who was in charge, he was then sexually assaulted many, many times by Ellis, who was a sadist, wasn't he?
He was sick. I was like his pet. That's what in the criminal trial, it worked out that I was like his pet. He did admit that I went to him the first time and told him. He went to the deputy assistant manager, and the assistant manager said not to take any notice, that the boys just make it up to go home. So the senior counsel then said, well, what did you do then? He said, I couldn't do anything because I would have missed my lift to Adelaide. And she said, well, what did you do when you came back on the Monday? And he said, I'd slipped my mind by then.
Yeah.
So there was nothing ever going to be done, and nothing was done. So.
Yeah. Can you tell us, now the sexual assaults didn't just occur at the home. Ellis, and you have to remember that the officers in charge at that home had complete control over the children's lives. Ellis used to take you away on trips and stay at his mother's house.
Well, we used to sell badges. Christmas time they had I wasn't allowed to go home until I was nearly 14, so my high school years. But we used to go every Christmas and sell badges and then go to a Lord Mayor's Christmas party. But he used to also take some of the kids back to his home.
Where his mother lived.
Yeah, he lived with his mother, and that was the worst, because before it was never sort of on a bed, if that makes sense. It was always in the boiler room or over the thing in the laundry. But at his home, his mother was deaf, and so it just continued for hours and hours. And he always took 2 of us, and he also took, which luckily I mentioned in the criminal case, they didn't know, he also took all the little Aboriginal boys regularly.
And Ellis didn't just rape children. Ellis also, because he believed in God, what did Ellis say?
Well, the worst for me, for Ellis, was I would have been 12, nearly 13, before I went to high school. Just before I went to high school, we used to go to Mount Barker Salvation Army Citadel maybe every 3 or 4 months and we used to give a little Bible reading or something like that to contribute. And so Ellis decided it'd be good if I gave the Bible reading. And so he used to take me into the staff room and lock the door and make me practice this Bible reading I had to do. But then, at the same time, he would be trying to rape me while I was reading the Bible. So it was sadistic.
He was a sick man.
Yeah.
Well, it is distressing to think about and talk about this kind of thing. This is Graham's life. Graham is going to be giving evidence at the Royal Commission, a public hearing on October the 6th. And so I think we'll suffice to say that Graham was the victim of horrendous abuse. Graham, once you finally got a bit older, Graham left the home and worked at a circus. Graham's had a very interesting life, and I suggest maybe you buy his book and his next book that's coming out, because there's way too much for us to try and compress into half an hour. But Graham has had a really interesting life. Graham, and because we are in this session, Graham, you tried to commit suicide twice, didn't you?
Yeah, 19 and...
At the age of
about
19?
22,
Yeah,
about 21.
22.
About 21.
Can you tell us just... Now, the day that I interviewed Graham, it was when we talked about his attempts at suicide that I started to really think this man is extraordinary. And it's going to sound a bit weird, but Graham and I actually laughed at a certain point because of the blackness of it's his way of dealing with things. So we're going to have to keep this short, and I don't like to talk about attempted suicide.
No, well, it just, because I have massive nightmares, and they're very real. Like, I can hear the sound. He used to have a cleft palate, Ellis, and he used to make a grunting noise, and I hear that. And anyway, I'd run away with the circus, and then I ran away from the circus because you couldn't just leave. And I was working in the bush, and I love the bush, so... And I'd worked, and the wheat harvest was over, and I had money, and I was really happy. And I had a stone house to stay in, had a fireplace, and I made a mistake, or someone gave me a bottle of grog. And I had no work, and it was raining for a week. And so nightmares came, and I drank the grog, bit more grog, bit more nightmares. And I had a sawn-off shotgun that I used to carry, and it just got that bad that I had a nightmare again, and it was so real, and of course, more grog, and I just thought, I'll shoot myself because I had a gun, and it just was so easy. I just put the shell in, cracked it, just real quick, nothing. And I was a bit shocked, and then I was pissed off because I couldn't kill myself, so I stood up the shits and I threw the gun, and of course it hit the wall and went bang. And I had one shell, because when I bought the gun off a guy I was working with, he just gave me lots of shells, but I practiced with it, so I only had one left. The second time was exactly the same, massive nightmares, and I thought, I go home, I'll be right, but I got into the grog again, a whole bottle of Southern Comfort, and I crashed, but then as I'm asleep, I'm dreaming, I wake up, so I think I slashed my wrist, and so I've still got the scars. I went bang as hard as I could, and it opened it right up. And it was with a can? A can, yeah. I'd had mushrooms on toast or something, and the can was still there. And it seriously would not bleed enough. And so I had another whack at it, and it just wouldn't bleed, and I realised then that it wasn't supposed to happen. And so I eventually went to the hospital and they stitched it up, and that was the 2 attempts at suicide. And it wasn't supposed to happen because Graham had something that to do. Beside me now is the man who basically opened the door for a lot of other people to take action against the Salvation Army. This is the man who started it, and it started. As I said, it's their worst nightmare. It started when. How old were you when you decided that you were going to go back to Eden Park? Well, before that, nobody knew in my family. Yeah. Because I thought, if I want to survive now, I'm going to have to make the boys' home the minor part. Yeah. And then, of course, I met someone fantastic. I had the most incredible children. And they're here today. And then 2 grandchildren. Also here today. Yeah, and they only found out because I said I started to take legal action, and I went back in 2000. I had Christmas with the kids, and I said, look, I'm going to have to go back. So Boxing Day, I got in the ute. I drove straight back. I didn't know it was there. It would be there. But I just thought, it doesn't matter if I go there. It might help the nightmares. But of course, when I drive there, it's heritage. And so everything's there, the lockups, everything. And so I thought, well, that should be good. So I went in and found the owners, and eventually it was like a commune. They said, yeah, come along. But then when I started to walk around, and the first rape was in the library where they dragged me under the steps. I hadn't remembered that up until I walked in the library, and that came back, and then as I walked around, it all came back.
So you were back to being a 7-year-old
Yeah, back to a
boy.
7-year-old. It was just like an explosion. Boom, and there it was.
Yeah.
Then when I came back, a lady I'd done work for, lots of times building work, she used to say sometimes, why do you shake? You know, you're shaking all the time. And I didn't want to tell her, but I just said something like, oh, I was in a home, and it was a bad home, and I have nightmares occasionally. And she said, which home? And eventually I found out she gave donations to the Salvation Army. She wrote a letter to Eastern Division, not my division, but eventually it all came back as they said, if you would like to contact us through lawyers, and that's how it started, which was in 2001.
So basically it started there, and your expectation was that the Salvation Army, being a God-fearing church with a good reputation as sort of caring for people, would care for you.
Well, they started off with everything will be done with care and compassion.
Yes.
That was the...
Remember those two words, care and compassion.
That's one of the first letters in the civil case and the criminal trial that comes up.
So I'm mindful of time, but Graham eventually made a statement to police and against Ellis.
Yes, because statute of limitations was lifted on criminal cases.
Yes.
So therefore they came to me.
Yes.
Because I'd been back in 2000 to the home, and I'd left my phone number and address.
This is the kind of legal, technical horror that people who've been sexually abused as children many years ago face. So that's just on the criminal side of things. We're not even going to start on the civil side of things.
Just one thing on the civil cases is you have to get statute of limitations, which is near impossible to get.
And that means where there's a time limit on when you can actually make a complaint, and there's all sorts of legal technicalities related.
But if you had actually been to a psychiatrist in any of those years, you would never have got statute of limitations, because they would argue that even if you didn't know, the fact that you'd been to a professional, they should have known, therefore no case.
It's the kind
the fact that I've never had any counselling at all, ever, I got through the civil case.
So there was charges against Ellis, and can you tell us just briefly what that trial was like and what Ellis was like in that trial?
I had the civil case running, then the police came to me, so I decided to go the criminal one at the same time. But Ellis decided that he didn't want to go to trial, so he changed his lawyers, which took another year. Then his lawyers left, which wasn't his fault because he became a judge. But then when we finally started getting him into court, he started faking illnesses. So it took 3.5 years to finally get him into court. We finally were about to start the criminal trial. I came home because I was going to give evidence first, and they said, no, you'd be best last. I just arrived home. I get a phone call from the police. They've now come up with this new idea that I've tainted everyone's evidence. So I have to then get on a plane the next morning, go back to Adelaide, have a separate trial on the evidence that I'd supposedly tainted. The reason for that was that they could separate me from the others. It would work, but it didn't work. They believed me. So then we start trial.
Basically, it's fair to say that the Salvation Army needed to fight every step of the way because Graham was first.
Yeah, and as I said, then he would fake illnesses. The moment it got too heavy for him, he would collapse. The ambulance would constantly come, but stop for 3 or 4 days, stop for a week, stop for 2 weeks. And eventually, the judge was about to stop the trial, and we argued that he should be sent for a test, which he was. Luckily, he came back. He only had a bit of sugar, which we knew, and he was deaf. But from then on, we had to pay to have a nurse sit with him through the whole trial, and every half an hour, take his blood pressure.
But eventually he was found guilty, and he screamed like a banshee when he was found guilty and wouldn't leave the court.
He couldn't walk before that. He had to have a special frame, but the moment he was guilty, the legs worked, and he wouldn't leave the court. He wouldn't actually get up.
So he's in jail now on a long sentence. Then there was the civil side of things, and we have a few minutes left. On the civil side of things, the Salvation Army, it is fair to say, fought you every step of the way, up to and including having some rather odd things happen during a trial where certain people who should have known better gave misleading evidence.
Salvation Army lawyers were charged with misleading the courts.
Graham, if you're going to stay boldly, yes. Here I am trying to protect the legal.
No. I've done it before. I know how far.
Yeah, the word misleading was used.
Yeah, so they were misleading with me.
Yes.
And of course, that will come up in the Royal Commission.
That will come up in the Royal. The misleading evidence could have stopped the civil action in its tracks, and Graham's civil action opened the door for civil action by many, many, many other people. So they needed to stop him, but they didn't.
And they won't. No, they won't.
Now, I will very briefly ask Graham, what is the way? So Graham's not had counselling, he doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke, he doesn't do weird and wonderful things. How have you managed to stay such a sane person despite dealing with the consequences? What do you do, Graham?
Well, I think knowing my grandma, my nana, she was tough. Like, the things I found out about her, she was
but loving.
Yeah, unbelievably. That's why I'm loving, I think, because of her. But the real thing is, all those times in the home you're told you're useless, you'll never amount to anything, you know, you'll never become anything, and I thought, stuff you, I will. And that's the drive.
Yeah.
The harder they dug in for the criminal case, the civil case, the harder I dug in. I sold everything. I had no cars left. I didn't even have a vehicle. I had treasures that I'd collected for, luckily, and I sold all that. They weren't forthcoming in the case whatsoever. In discovery, we gave them everything they had, they gave us nothing. They only ever told me what they didn't have, just trying to stop the case.
And this is a man that the Salvation Army gave a number to when he was a child, and that number?
44, and it's just odd.
And it's on this.
It's written on here.
This microphone, 44. So
this must be mine to take.
Yeah. So Graham really has been extraordinary. The one thing I was asking you about, Graham lives on the Central Coast and he has a garden. And that garden is on a ridge, a beautiful ridge in the bush, and that garden includes a hell of a lot of rock. Can you tell us about the rock?
That garden actually saved me. Being a hard worker all my life, like lots of jobs, then I have to do all this mental stuff for years. Like, it took 10 years for the civil case.
Yep.
And $500,000. I couldn't work out why. I was being more depressed, and I thought, I'm going to have to beat this. And I thought it must be physical. So I started doing a little bit of rockery, and I'm talking big rocks.
They're flogging big rocks.
I'd put them on logs and push the bastards with a crowbar.
And he lives on a ridge.
But that was the saviour, because the moment I did the physical, I was back to where I should be. I was back to being strong. The moment I didn't do anything...
He has a beautiful garden, and it's extraordinary. And our time is up, but I think you've got a little bit of a sense of what this man is like. The Royal Commission, the public hearing where Graham is going to give evidence, it's in Adelaide. I suggest you get onto the Royal Commission's website because it's live streamed, and then you'll get a real sense of how extraordinary Graham really is. Thank you very much for being here today, and thank you, Graham.
Thank you.
Can I just say, please, his book 44, my daughter was scared to read it, and she loved it because it's full of the human condition And with all the tragedy and abuse he experienced, somehow that love he has for life and that his nana, and it's shown in his family, resonates in the book. And it's something that will enrich you to read it. And I do implore you to buy 44. And I'd like to say, you know, men like Graham inspire us every day. Thank you for coming to see us. Well, he'll be over there to sign books when you buy them.
Oh, that's really?
I have one. Sign.
How'd you go with that?
I know we didn't go. Oh, okay. You look amazing. So no, well, didn't stop me from crying. You're amazing. Yeah, she's and a lot of women, so not similar. Liar. I don't think so.
Yeah, that was. I tell you what, it's real up there.
Yeah. Oh yes, because you've got.
Yeah.
We had a bit of a.
That's Nikki Davis of Snap.
The crossroads, right? So if you're reading it right,
Is that Graham Rundle talking to Gay Follington?
Did you get the hail?